when the sky turned black with millions of winged creatures. And the gods of Egypt remained powerless. Do you know what the sound of the apocalypse feels like? It's not thunder. It's not a tsunami. It's a buzzing, millions upon millions of flies blanketing the sky. One morning, the Egyptians woke up and saw no more sunlight, only a moving black veil, stretching from the lowlands to the palace. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to breathe. Flies crawled into clothes, into ears, into mouths. They didn't bite, but they destroyed. From peasants to soldiers, from commoners to royalty, everyone was brought to their knees by the swarm. Not a natural disaster, not an accident, but a deliberate strike was sent by a god delivering his fourth warning. A warning that Pharaoh, despite witnessing the first 3 plagues, still chose to ignore.
If you do not let my people go, I will send swarms of flies throughout your land.
After 3 devastating warnings, water turning to blood, the plague of frogs and biting gnats, Egypt still had not learned its lesson. Pharaoh, despite witnessing his nation in chaos, refused to yield. He believed he was engaged in a political chess match with Moses, without realizing he was contending with the Almighty. His heart remained hardened, and the innocent people of Egypt began to suffer. They once thought the early plagues were mere coincidences, weather anomalies, or natural problems. But by the 4th plague, all doubt vanished. No one could deny this was a deliberate, destructive chain of miracles. And this time it struck at another vulnerability in Egyptian society: order, cleanliness, and control. In ancient Egyptian civilization, cleanliness was a sacred value. Priests shaved their heads, bathed multiple times a day, and never allowed themselves to be defiled during religious rituals. The Egyptians believed cleanliness was a form of worship, an act of reverence to their gods. Filth, in contrast, was considered an offense. Now imagine what happens when every corner is swarmed with flies, when there's no longer a distinction between royalty and farmer, when the entire kingdom is engulfed in buzzing, rotting flesh, feces, and trash. This wasn't just a physical disaster, it was a direct assault on the spiritual foundation of an entire civilization. But then something remarkable happened. The land of Goshen, where the Hebrews lived, remained untouched. No flies, no chaos, no plague. For the first time, a clear line was drawn between Egypt and the Hebrew people, an unmistakable sign. This was no longer a coincidence. This was judgment, when the sky is no longer a place of peace, but the beginning of a nightmare. No one heard thunder. No one saw lightning. There was no sign of a coming disaster, just a sound, a hum. Small at first, then growing louder, until it became a roar. Flies. Not a few buzzing around a meal. Not some hovering over fruit. But a swarm, millions, descending from nowhere like a black storm. They swept through the fields, the markets, the homes, and the palaces. They entered the nostrils, ears, and even the eyes of the people. There was no shelter, no clean place left. Flies covered human faces, covered statues of gods, covered every step of the royal palace. They weren't just disgusting, they brought destruction. They laid eggs in fresh meat, causing food to rot rapidly. They carried bacteria, spreading disease to humans and livestock. They blinded eyes, caused skin ulcers, and drove the Egyptians mad with itching and pain. Ancient texts, both biblical and Egyptian, describe this plague with words like decay, devastation, and filth. Can't perform rituals, can't cook, can't live like a normal human being. The plague of flies stripped away Egypt's greatest pride, control. Pharaoh had once stood among his gods and declared,
"I alone hold the power of life and death."
But now he couldn't even command a single fly to leave his meal. The situation spiraled out of control. The magicians who had once mimicked the miracles were helpless. No spell could drive the flies away. No prayer had any effect. The gods of Egypt, from Hapi to Khepri, remained silent. And that's when Moses returned, this time with a clear warning.
If you do not let my people go, I will send swarms of flies upon your land. But the region of Goshen, where my people live, will be spared.
Pharaoh scoffed again, and just as warned, the flies came. Goshen? Not a single fly. One plague, two outcomes. It was the clearest message yet. God doesn't just control nature. He controls boundaries. He decides where judgment falls. He chooses who gets protected. Flies, small, insignificant, became an army that shook an empire. And this was only the fourth plague. Flies, creatures of chaos and decay. In ancient Egyptian culture, flies were more than a nuisance. They symbolized death, decay, and filth. Interestingly, Egyptians even carved fly shapes into war medals, not out of respect, but to represent the tireless persistence of an enemy. Flies were seen as relentless foes, impossible to destroy. Now that enemy wasn't metaphorical anymore. It had invaded the palace. The royal chambers of Pharaoh now buzzed with filth. This was no lightning strike, no earthquake. This was a divine assault carried out by what we'd call dirty flies. In a society obsessed with cleanliness, order, and ritual, a land blanketed in flies was a direct challenge to the foundation of their civilization. Pharaoh, symbol of order, confronted by chaos. In Egypt's religious political system, Pharaoh wasn't just a king. He was the living embodiment of the god Horus, the keeper of Ma'at, the cosmic order. Flies, uncountable, deafening, filthy, represented the opposite, Isfet, chaos. This plague revealed Pharaoh had lost control. He couldn't maintain order. He couldn't protect his people. He was no longer the guardian of the universe, just a powerless man inside a palace of decay. Khepri, the silent god, publicly shamed. If the first plague struck at Hapi, god of the Nile, this fourth one targeted Khepri, the scarab-headed god of the rising sun, rebirth, and eternal cycles. Egyptians believed Khepri rolled the sun across the sky like a beetle rolls dung, bringing light each morning. Flies, close relatives to beetles, now appeared as Khepri's corrupted image. They didn't bring life. They didn't carry the sun. They brought rot, disease, and darkness. It was an unspoken declaration. Your God cannot even control his form. The distinction: Israel protected, Egypt not. For the first time in the sequence of plagues, a clear boundary was established. A line is drawn between those under God's protection and those outside of it. But on that day I will deal differently with the land of Goshen, where my people live. No swarms of flies will be there, so that you will know that I, the Lord, am in this land. This is a profound symbol of divine choice and absolute power. Flies, creatures of the air, are not limited by fences or geography, and yet they avoided the land of Goshen as if an invisible wall had been raised. This wasn't just an environmental miracle. It was a miracle of moral order. God did not simply act. He made a distinction between the judged and the protected. This marks a clear progression in the plagues. Not just punishment, but a divine identification of who belongs to him. A subtle miracle, sharper than a sword. There was no explosion, No volcanic eruption, just flies, tiny things that shattered every pretense of pride. This was a deliberate strategy in God's judgment sequence. No need for falling stars or instant annihilation. He used the most ordinary of things to expose the weakness of what appeared to be the most powerful. Flies, symbols of decayed life, rotten faith, and false order, became a test of patience, pride, and belief. The plague of flies wasn't just a biological incident. It was an indictment against a civilization built on arrogance. It was a declaration that the Almighty controls all, from the sky to the smallest winged pest. And it paved the way for the plagues to come, each one deeper, not just physically but spiritually. Did swarms of flies overrun Egypt? The first question scholars often ask is, how could flies, seemingly harmless, become a nationwide catastrophe? In reality, ancient Egypt recorded multiple instances of insect infestations, especially in texts known as pestilence journals or lamentations. Documents from the Middle Kingdom period, 2055 to 1650 BC, describe a time when the air reeked with stench, insects filled the skies, devouring corpses and even the eyes of the living. People covered their faces, plugged their ears, and abandoned their homes. Whether they were flies, gnats, or a combination of both, the biblical narrative may have been shaped by a very real collective memory. The link to previous plagues, ecosystem collapse. From a scientific standpoint, a chain reaction could explain it. The Nile turns to blood, or red due to red algae, killing off fish. Without fish, frogs invade the land. Plague 2. Frogs die in masses. Decaying bodies create ideal breeding grounds for flies and other insects. In other words, a shattered ecosystem may have led to the explosion of flies. Some microbiologists point out, flies don't need a reason. Just give them enough rotting matter, and they'll arrive like a tsunami, possibly biting flies, carriers of the deadly disease. Another theory, the flies in this plague weren't ordinary houseflies, but biting species like horseflies, sandflies, or tsetse flies, known to transmit disease. This matters because it connects directly to the next plague, pestilence on livestock and humans. If millions of flies were biting humans and animals, spreading parasites or pathogens, then no weapons would be needed. Within days, a nation's immune system could collapse. A team from the British Institute of Insect Biology remarked, "Flies may have been the most lethal weapon of the ancient world. They killed without leaving a single visible wound. Archaeological layers, traces of flies? In some Egyptian tombs, archaeologists discovered fly-shaped amulets, worn as necklaces or buried with the deceased. At first, these were believed to symbolize endurance, but some scholars now suggest they were charms against disease, a way of honoring flies to repel flies, a reflection of deep cultural fear surrounding insect-borne plagues, something ancient people couldn't explain. They had no microscopes, but they saw the aftermath. People dying without a clear cause, animals dropping ill, skies darkened with flies every time decay set in. Subconsciously, flies became associated with death and impurity. Truth, miracle, or a legend with roots in reality? The fourth plague doesn't necessarily have to be seen as entirely supernatural. Whether one believes in the Bible or not, several factors remain clear. There's a plausible chain of biological events. Cultural and archaeological evidence suggests Egyptians truly faced insect swarms. There's a moral trajectory. The plagues grow in selectivity and directly challenge symbols of power like Egyptian deities or the Pharaoh's role. As one scholar aptly summarized, "You may not believe God sent the flies, but there's no doubt Egypt once knew the feeling of being swallowed alive by them." From another perspective, one that cuts deeper than physical fear, the plague of flies posed a searing spiritual question. If the gods of Egypt were real, why were they silent as the nation was ravaged by flies? A blow to cleanliness and the hierarchy of purity. In ancient Egyptian culture, cleanliness was a virtue. Priests shaved every hair from their bodies and bathed 2 to 3 times a day. Temples were meticulously swept. Dust was not tolerated. Society was strictly tiered. Who was clean, who was unclean, and who was worthy to approach the gods. But flies don't recognize social class. They flew into the mouths of kings just as easily as they swarmed the rotting dead. They defiled temples, altars, and even the throne itself. When flies invaded Egypt, it wasn't just bodies being violated. It was the very concept of sacred torn apart. What was once holy was now as filthy as the gutter. A critical detail from the Bible: "On that day I will set apart the land of Goshen, where my people dwell. No swarm of flies will be there." Flies engulfed Egypt, but not a single one entered the homes of the Hebrews. No one could explain it. No fences, no insect repellent, no advanced technology. Just one thing: God's command. If that were true, then this was no natural disaster. It was an intentional miracle, a warning no one could pretend not to see. God dismantled Egypt's gods, one by one. Look back at the first 4 plagues, and you'll see a clear pattern. The water turned to blood, struck Hapi, god of the Nile. Frogs overran the land, struck Heket, the frog-headed goddess of fertility. Dust turned to gnats, struck Geb, god of the earth. Swarms of flies struck Khepri, god of the rising sun, symbolized by the scarab. In other words, God wasn't performing miracles for spectacle. He was toppling Egypt's gods, one religious pillar at a time. Not to torment, but to speak. Egypt's language was power, so God spoke in power. And after all that, the most shocking part wasn't the flies. It was Pharaoh's response. The Bible says, "But Pharaoh hardened his heart again and would not let the people go." People cried out. The stench infiltrated every meal. Temples crawled with insects. Yet Pharaoh remained unmoved. What could cause someone to witness the irrational and still reject change? Is pride stronger than fear? Does power blind the soul? These plagues weren't just disasters. They were a war over will, over spirit, over the very identity of an empire. A small blow, but one that shook the divine foundation of Egypt. Flies don't kill. They're not fire from heaven, nor earthquakes, but flies are a deafening whisper that cannot be ignored. They appear everywhere, not to destroy, but to remind. There is a power greater than you, and if you won't listen, this is only the beginning. The 4th plague didn't end in death, but in numbness. Pharaoh still lived, still ruled, and still hardened his heart. But that didn't mean he won. On the contrary, he was quietly losing. Losing in his mind, in his faith, and in his ability to command reality. This is only the 4th plague. 6 more warnings await ahead. And as you'll soon see, every limit will be shattered. So what can we learn from the flies? Truth doesn't always come with thunder. Sometimes it arrives in the smallest buzz. A plague doesn't always need blood. Sometimes it simply turns your normal upside down. And if you don't learn from the quiet warning, you'll be forced to learn from the crushing blow. If you find this series meaningful, share it. This isn't just a story from the past. It's a mirror for the present, because every empire, no matter how powerful, will tremble if it refuses to listen. Hit follow so you won't miss the fifth plague, when death begins to show its face.